The house was quiet that evening. Claire had just returned from work, tired but relieved to be home. The soft hum of the heater and the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser filled the living room. She noticed Ethan sitting on the couch, rubbing his shoulders with a pained expression. He looked tense, the kind of tightness that didn't go away with just rest. Claire had watched him struggle with heavy boxers at his part-time job earlier in the week, and it was clear the stress had caught up with him. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if he wanted her to ask, then spoke softly. "Hey, Ethan, do you want me to help with that? Maybe a quick massage." Ethan's head lifted slightly, his brown eyes meeting hers with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Yeah, maybe," he said quietly. There was something in his voice that made Claire pause. He wasn't just asking for physical relief. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet plea that tugged at her heart. She gestured toward the armchair and said, "Come sit here. I'll try to make it better." As he shifted into position, she began working on his shoulders. Her hands moved carefully, pressing into the knots she could feel beneath his shirt. The room was silent except for the low hum of the heater, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the soft sound of Ethan exhaling as tension left his body. Claire noticed how he leaned into her touch slightly, a subtle sign that he trusted her. She had seen him reserved around others, even around her husband sometimes. But now in this quiet moment, he seemed open, almost fragile. "You've got a lot of tension here," she said softly. "Your shoulders are really tight." Ethan shrugged, a small nervous laugh escaping him. "I guess I've been working too much, carrying boxes, lifting things. It adds up." He looked down for a moment, and then something in his tone shifted. "Actually, can you? Maybe show me how to relax more, like really unwind." Claire stopped for a second, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. The request was innocent enough, but it carried an emotional weight. It wasn't just about muscles. It was about wanting comfort, wanting guidance. She swallowed the slight surprise that rose in her chest and nodded. "Of course," she said calmly. "Let's start with some breathing." She guided him through slow, deep breaths, her hands gently pressing against his back and shoulders as she instructed him to focus on letting the tension go. The air in the room felt warmer, softer, like a protective bubble away from the stress of their daily lives. As they continued, Ethan's body visibly loosened. His breathing became steadier, slower, and more relaxed. Claire noticed how the corners of his mouth turned up slightly, a small but telling sign of relief. It was more than physical. She could see the emotional release, the unspoken weight lifting off his shoulders. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, not romantic in a forbidden sense, but a deep compassion mixed with concern. She cared for him, yes, as her stepson. But she also realized she hadn't expected to feel this level of responsibility for someone else's comfort. "You're doing great," she said softly, her voice steady. Ethan's eyes flicked up to hers for a brief moment. She noticed something in his gaze, gratitude, relief, and perhaps a flicker of curiosity about this new closeness between them. He shifted slightly, letting her hands reach areas that had been tight for weeks, trusting her without hesitation. Claire marveled at the simplicity of the moment to people, connected by care, in a room that felt small and safe. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly after a few minutes, his voice carrying a softness that made Claire pause. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." There was no awkwardness, no forced compliment, just a plain, honest expression of relief. Claire nodded, smiling gently. "Sometimes we don't notice the tension until someone helps us with it," she replied. Her hands continued moving methodically, working out the tight spots, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about how life had a way of connecting people in unexpected ways, how small gestures could carry enormous emotional weight. Ethan let out a long sigh, one that sounded like he had been holding it in for days. "It feels different," he admitted, almost shyly. Claire recognized that tone he was comfortable with her, yet still discovering boundaries, testing what it meant to trust someone fully. She kept her hands steady, reassuring him through touch, presence, and patience. Moments like this didn't happen often, and she silently acknowledged the quiet significance of it. After a while, she eased her hands away and stepped back slightly. Ethan stretched, rolling his shoulders, looking lighter somehow, as if the weight he carried had physically shifted. "Wow, that actually helped," he said, laughing softly. There was a spark of relief and playfulness now, the first real warmth she had seen since he moved in. Claire felt a smile tug at her lips. "I'm glad," she replied. "Remember, relaxing is a skill too. It's okay to take the time you need." They sat quietly for a moment, just the two of them, not speaking, letting the atmosphere settle. Claire realized something important tonight wasn't just about easing sore muscles. It was about trust, comfort, and the quiet human need to be understood. The connection they shared in that small, softly lit room was new, fragile, but meaningful. She could sense that Ethan valued it more than he could put into words, and she found herself wanting to preserve it. Protect it, just as she was about to suggest he get some water. Ethan spoke again, softly, almost as if he was testing the air. "Thanks for this, for being here. It really means a lot." His words weren't just about the massage, they were about the emotional presence she had given him. Claire nodded, feeling a rush of gentle pride and affection. "You don't have to thank me," she said, though her voice carried warmth. "I'm happy to help." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. The evening had started as a simple gesture, motherly step to ease physical tension, but it had grown into something deeper, an emotional bridge. Claire realized that these small acts of care could open doors to understanding, emotional safety, and human connection that went far beyond the obvious. As the night grew darker outside, and the faint glow of the lamp cast soft shadows across the room, Claire and Ethan shared a peaceful silence. The unspoken understanding, the subtle shift in their relationship, lingered in the air. Claire felt a complex mix of emotions: protectiveness, warmth, and a gentle fascination at the closeness that had developed so unexpectedly. She knew that tonight was only the beginning. Something had changed between them, a quiet emotional bond had been formed, one that neither could ignore. And as Claire turned to tidy up a small pile of blankets, she felt the subtle tension of anticipation. She didn't yet know how far this new closeness would go. She sensed that it would shape their relationship in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ethan, sitting quietly on the couch, seemed lighter, calmer, and somehow more open. The room was filled with an air of quiet promise, the kind of intimacy that didn't need words, just presence, understanding, and human warmth. For Claire, that evening would stay in her mind for a long time. It was the night she realized that sometimes helping someone physically could open a door to emotional connection that was gentle, profound, and quietly transformative. And she couldn't help but wonder what would happen the next time he asked for her help. The weekend arrived quietly, the kind that promised calm and small, unhurried moments. Claire spent the morning tidying the house, sipping her coffee slowly, trying to enjoy the rare peace. Ethan was unusually quiet that day. He moved around the kitchen with a distracted energy, humming softly but looking thoughtful. Claire noticed it immediately. There was something on his mind, a hint of hesitation in the way he handled the dishes and rearranged the chairs. She tried to ignore the curiosity building inside her, but when he finally glanced up, his eyes met hers. And she knew he was going to speak. "Claire, could you help me again?" His voice was low, almost uncertain. With the shoulders thing." There was a nervous edge to the words, like he wasn't sure if it was okay to ask. And the way he said her first name instead of Mom made the moment feel unusually intimate. Claire felt her heart skip a beat. She could see he wasn't just asking for relief from tension. He was asking for a connection, something more than physical comfort. She smiled gently, trying to hide the flutter in her chest. "Of course, Ethan. Come sit here." Ethan moved to the armchair, a little slower than usual, and shifted uncomfortably for a moment before settling in. Claire approached him with a calm, reassuring presence, placing her hands on his shoulders with care. The air felt heavy with anticipation, though neither of them spoke about it. Her hands worked carefully over the knots and tight spots she remembered from last time. As she massaged Ethan's body, gradually relaxed, and she noticed him leaning slightly into her touch. It wasn't just trust, it was a quiet acknowledgement of comfort, of safety, of someone being there for him without judgment. He began talking. First about small things, like work schedules and minor stresses. His words came hesitantly at first, like testing the water. Work has been kind of exhausting, he said, letting out a soft sigh. And school, too. I feel like I can never catch up. Claire nodded, keeping her hands steady, letting him release tension physically while also opening up emotionally. I know how that feels, she said. Sometimes it just helps to take one step at a time and not push too hard on yourself. Ethan listened quietly, then shifted slightly, his voice dropping a little. It's just hard sometimes. I try to do everything right, but I end up feeling tired, lonely even. The confession wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight. Claire felt a pang in her chest, a mix of empathy and concern. It was rare to see him so open, so vulnerable. You're not alone, she said softly. I'm here, and it's okay to lean on someone when you need to. Her words seemed to comfort him. Ethan exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. Claire continued her gentle massage, pressing carefully on the spots that were tight, guiding him to breathe deeply, encouraging him to release not only the physical tension, but also the emotional burdens he carried. The room felt warmer, quieter, and somehow more private than before, as if they had created their own little world. Claire. Ethan's voice came unexpectedly soft. She looked up and found his gaze fixed on her. There was a quiet earnestness in his eyes, a vulnerability that tugged at her heart. You always make things feel easier, he said. The words were simple, yet loaded with meaning. Claire felt a rush of emotion, protectiveness, care, and something deeper, a sense of connection that she hadn't anticipated. She reminded herself gently. He was her stepson, a young man navigating life and family changes. Still, the closeness in that room, the trust, and the warmth were undeniable. They continued like this for a while. Ethan began opening up more about his friends, about feeling left out sometimes, and the pressures of fitting in. Claire listened attentively, offering reassurance when needed and advice when appropriate. It wasn't just a massage. It was a conversation filled with understanding, patience, and emotional intimacy. She realized that these moments of connection were rare and precious. It wasn't physical attraction, it was emotional, a deep human need to be seen, heard, and cared for. Ethan shifted again, leaning slightly forward, resting his hands on his knees. I don't usually talk about this stuff, he admitted, voice low. But with you, it feels easier. Like I can actually say what's on my mind. Claire smiled gently, feeling the weight of the moment. That's what family is for, Ethan. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. Her hands continued their work, pressing and kneading gently, guiding him to relax both physically and emotionally. Minutes passed quietly. The tension in the room was still present, but transformed. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was a connection built on trust and care. Claire noticed a subtle change in Ethan's demeanor. He was lighter, calmer, more open. The walls he had carried around him, whether from shyness or previous life experiences, seemed to soften in her presence. She understood that what he needed wasn't just a massage, it was reassurance, guidance, and a safe space to be himself at one point. He let out a long sigh and leaned back. Eyes closed, a small, almost shy smile on his face. I don't know why this helps so much, he said quietly, but it really does. You really listen. You make me feel like someone actually cares. Claire felt a lump in her throat. These were words no one had said to her in a long time either, and she felt a deep connection to his honesty. She continued, pressing gently along his shoulder blades, guiding him to release the last bits of tension. The evening continued in this rhythm-touch conversation, care. Ethan's voice grew softer and more honest, revealing small insecurities and quiet hopes. Claire responded with empathy, sharing simple life lessons and little encouragements. Each word and gesture built trust, a sense of emotional safety that neither of them had expected. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond forged in moments of honesty and care. Finally, she eased her hands from his shoulders, letting him stretch and adjust. Ethan looked up at her, eyes shining with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thanks, Claire. I didn't know I needed that," he admitted softly. She nodded, smiling warmly. "It's okay. Sometimes we just need someone to help us breathe, to help us feel like it's all right to let go for a while." They sat in silence for a few moments, the air between them filled with quiet satisfaction. Claire realized that these small gestures, listening, touching gently, offering support, had opened a door. It wasn't about romance, nor about crossing boundaries. It was about human connection, about emotional closeness, and about being present for someone who needed it. She felt a strange mixture of pride, warmth, and curiosity about what this new closeness would mean for their relationship going forward. As the night wore on, and the soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across the living room, Claire sensed a subtle shift in their dynamic. Ethan seemed lighter, calmer, and more willing to be open. The bond they had created was delicate, emotional, and profound. She understood that this was only the beginning, that moments like this could shape the way they trusted each other, the way they navigated their blended family life, and the way they supported each other through challenges. For Claire, this evening would linger in her thoughts long after Ethan went to his room. It had been more than a massage. It had been an emotional connection, a gentle awakening of trust, and a quiet understanding that sometimes care could be expressed in subtle, intimate ways that were entirely wholesome and human. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: tonight had changed the way they related to each other, creating a foundation of trust and understanding that neither of them had expected. And as she tidied the room, Claire couldn't help but wonder what Ethan might ask next time. She knew he trusted her, and she knew that the emotional bond between them had grown in ways that were gentle, profound, and entirely appropriate. It was a quiet, heartfelt connection, and it was only the beginning. The storm outside rumbled softly, rain tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm that made the house feel smaller, warmer, and safer. Claire sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a book resting on her lap, though she wasn't really reading. Across from her, Ethan sat curled up in his chair, staring out the window at the sheets of rain. There was a heaviness in his posture, a quiet tension that Claire had learned to recognize. She had seen it before, but tonight it felt deeper, more persistent. She could sense that he wanted to say something. The weight of anticipation hung in the air like the storm outside. "Claire," he began softly, his voice hesitant. He didn't look at her immediately, keeping his gaze on the gray blur of rain. "Could you stay a bit? Just talk with me?" The request was simple, almost shy, but it carried an emotional vulnerability that pulled at her heart. Claire set her book aside and shifted closer, sitting at a comfortable distance, but close enough to convey support. "Of course, Ethan," she said gently. "I'm here." For the first few minutes, neither spoke much. The sound of rain filled the pauses, each drop a soft punctuation to the silence. Then, slowly, Ethan began to speak, first about small, everyday things: work, his classes, minor annoyances at the grocery store, and friends he hadn't spoken to in a while. But gradually, his words turned more personal. He talked about feeling left out, about uncertainty over his future, about nights when he felt alone, even in a crowded room. His voice was quiet but steady, and Claire listened intently, giving him her full attention. "You know," Ethan said finally, after a pause, "I've never really talked to anyone like this before. Not about stuff that matters." He glanced at her, eyes searching, almost pleading for understanding. Claire nodded, her hands resting gently in her lap. "Sometimes it just takes finding the right person to listen," she replied softly. "And that's okay. You don't have to hold everything inside." As she spoke, she noticed a subtle change in him. He shifted slightly, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His shoulders, usually tense and guarded, began to relax in her presence. Claire realized that what he needed was not just a sounding board, but comfort. It's a safe space to share, to be vulnerable without fear of judgment. She offered quiet encouragement with her voice, her gentle nods, and her steady, supportive presence. Hours seemed to pass in this intimate rhythm. Ethan's stories were sometimes funny, sometimes tinged with sadness. And Claire found herself drawn in by the depth of his honesty. She shared a few stories of her own, memories from her college years, small regrets and moments of triumph, offering lessons learned in the gentlest way. The more they spoke, the more the storm outside seemed to fade into the background, as if the walls of the house had wrapped them in a private world where nothing else mattered at one point. Ethan leaned slightly closer, resting his head against the arm of the couch. Claire instinctively draped a protective arm around his shoulders. It wasn't an impulsive gesture. It was natural, a reflex born from care and emotional connection. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, he relaxed into her presence, his eyes closing for a moment as he let out a soft sigh. Claire felt a mixture of emotions, compassion, protectiveness, and a sense of closeness that was difficult to describe. It was not romantic in a forbidden sense. It was human, gentle, and deeply emotional. "You make things feel lighter," Ethan admitted quietly, almost as if he was sharing a secret he hadn't meant to say aloud. Claire's heart warmed at the sincerity in his words. She adjusted slightly to make sure he was comfortable, offering reassurance with a soft, calm voice. "Sometimes life feels heavier than it should," she said. "But talking, sharing, being honest, it helps carry the weight." Ethan nodded slowly. "I guess. I never realized how much I needed someone like this," he said. His words weren't dramatic or exaggerated. They were honest, simple, and profound. Claire recognized that he was learning to trust her, to let go of barriers that had kept him guarded. And she understood that her role in his life had shifted subtly from being just a stepmother figure to being someone he could rely on emotionally, someone who offered safety, patience, and understanding. They continued in this quiet intimacy. Rain pattered against the windows, the storm's occasional rumble punctuating the room's calm. Ethan's voice grew softer, his confessions more candid. He spoke about past mistakes, moments of regret, and times he had felt misunderstood. Claire listened without interruption, offering a gentle comment or nod when appropriate, never rushing him, never judging. She realized that this openness, this level of trust, was rare and precious. It created a bond that was emotional, tender, and meaningful, you know? "I don't really talk like this with anyone," Ethan said after a long pause, his gaze meeting hers. "But with you, it's different. I feel like I can actually be myself." Claire smiled softly. "That's exactly how it should feel," she said. "You deserve to have someone who listens, who cares, without making you feel judged or rushed." Minutes passed, yet the quiet comfort lingered. Claire's presence was steady and reassuring, and Ethan's gradual relaxation reflected the trust growing between them. He leaned back slightly, closing his eyes, letting the tension melt from his shoulders and his mind. For Claire, it was a moment of deep realization. This was more than a simple conversation. It was emotional healing, a connection built on honesty, care, and understanding. The intimacy they shared was powerful, not in a romantic or physical sense, but in the emotional resonance that only trust and vulnerability can create. Finally, the storm outside began to wane, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle. Ethan exhaled a long, steady breath that seemed to release the burdens he had carried all day. "I feel better," he admitted softly. Claire nodded, smiling warmly. "I'm glad. Sometimes that's all it takes, a little time, a little understanding, and someone who cares." They stayed there a while longer, wrapped in the quiet warmth of the room. The storm had passed, but the emotional intensity remained, a subtle bond between them that neither could ignore. Claire felt a deep sense of satisfaction and connection. This wasn't about romance or attraction, it was about emotional closeness, trust, and the human need to be heard and understood. Ethan had shared pieces of himself he hadn't shared with anyone else, and she had offered the safe space for him to do so. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan stood and stretched, looking lighter, calmer, and more at ease than she had seen in months. He glanced at her with a small smile, eyes reflecting quiet gratitude. "Thanks, Claire. I really needed this," he said. She smiled back, warmth filling her chest. "Anytime, Ethan. Remember, it's okay to lean on someone when you need it. You're not alone." The night ended, but the emotional impact lingered. Claire knew that this evening had changed something between them. Their relationship had grown stronger, rooted in trust and care, with a delicate, unspoken understanding that would influence the days to come. She realized that moments like these, small, simple, and emotionally honest, could shape relationships more deeply than grand gestures ever could. As she tidied the blanket and prepared to head to her room, she couldn't help but feel a quiet anticipation. The bond they shared had shifted subtly, forming a foundation of trust and emotional intimacy that neither had expected. And she wondered what the next step in their journey would look like. For both of them, this evening had been transformative, a reminder that sometimes connection isn't about words. It's about presence, understanding, and emotional support that comes from the heart. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world outside wet and glistening under the faint glow of streetlights. Inside, the house felt calm, quiet, and safe. Claire sat on the living room rug, a blanket draped across her shoulders, while Ethan stretched out on the couch nearby. There was a softness in the air, a quiet intimacy that came not from words or gestures, but from shared presence and understanding. The evening had been long, emotional, and revealing. Claire could sense that the bond they had formed over the past few days, the trust, the openness, the quiet care, was at a pivotal moment. "Would you like me to continue helping you relax?" Claire asked softly, her voice gentle but steady. Ethan glanced at her, a small, appreciative smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I think that would help," he admitted. Claire nodded and positioned herself so she could continue working on his shoulders and back. Her movements, calm, careful, and professional. There was nothing inappropriate in her touch. It was a gesture of care, an act of comfort, and a continuation of the emotional support she had been giving him since he moved in. As she worked, Ethan's body gradually loosened under her hands. The muscles that had been tense for weeks slowly softened, and with each motion, he seemed to release not only physical strain but also the lingering stress and worry that had weighed on him. Claire focused on the rhythm of her movements, steady and deliberate, letting the quiet energy of the room carry them both into a state of calm. She noticed how the small moments of stillness, the slow exhale, the gentle shift of weight, the brief eye contact were as meaningful as any conversation. "You know," Ethan began after a few minutes, his voice quiet and reflective, "I didn't think talking to someone could feel this easy or comforting." Claire smiled gently, continuing to massage the knots in his shoulders. "Sometimes we just need someone to listen," she said, "and to care without judgment. That's all it takes to feel lighter." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the floor for a moment before returning to hers. There was a quiet honesty in his eyes, a recognition of the care she had given him. "I guess I didn't realize how much I needed that," he admitted. Claire felt a warm pang in her chest, not romantic in the forbidden sense, but a deep, heartfelt response to the trust and vulnerability he was showing. She adjusted her position slightly to make him more comfortable, her hands steady, her focus entirely on his well-being. The conversation that followed was gentle and reflective. Ethan spoke about past challenges, fears of the future, and moments when he had felt unsure of himself. Claire offered quiet guidance, simple advice, and encouragement, never pushing or judging. It was a dialogue that flowed naturally, an exchange of care and understanding that strengthened the bond between them. She realized that what he needed most wasn't just relief from tension, it was reassurance, emotional support, and the knowledge that someone cared for him unconditionally. "You know, it's strange," Ethan said after a pause, "but I feel like I can tell you things I wouldn't say to anyone else, not even my friends." Claire nodded, smiling softly. "That's because you feel safe here. You know that I won't judge you, that I'm just here to listen and help." He exhaled slowly, leaning back into the couch, his shoulders visibly lighter than they had been earlier. The storm outside mirrored the release inside the room. The tension had gone, replaced by quiet understanding and emotional calm. As the evening progressed, Claire suggested they move to a more comfortable position so they could continue in a casual, relaxed way. Ethan agreed, adjusting on the couch while Claire maintained her careful, supportive presence. The conversation turned lighter then, filled with small jokes, reflections on the day, and moments of laughter that eased the emotional intensity without diminishing it. There was a balance now: comfort, trust, and warmth mixed with playfulness and ease. At one point, Ethan looked at her with quiet gratitude. "Claire, thank you for being here. I don't know if I've ever had someone who just cared like this." Claire felt a lump in her throat. His words were simple, yet profound. "I'm glad I can be that for you," she replied softly. "Everyone deserves someone to care, Ethan, and you deserve to feel safe and supported." The night wore on, and the emotional bond between them became more evident. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was deeper, rooted in empathy, trust, and mutual respect. Claire realized that this closeness, this intimacy of the heart, was rare and precious. It was the kind of connection that could influence their relationship for years to come, shaping the way they communicated, supported each other, and navigated their blended family life. Eventually, Ethan shifted, stretching his arms above his head and letting out a long, contented sigh. "I feel so much better now," he admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. Claire nodded, her own smile soft but full of warmth. "I'm glad," she said. "Sometimes it's the small things, someone listening, it's helping you breathe, giving support, that make the biggest difference." They sat quietly for a few moments after that, neither speaking, just enjoying the calm after the storm. Claire noticed a subtle change in Ethan. He seemed lighter, more open, and more willing to trust the world around him. The emotional release had been powerful, and the bond they shared had deepened. Claire herself felt lighter too, grateful for the opportunity to provide care, to offer comfort, and to strengthen the connection with someone who mattered to her. As the clock ticked later into the night, Claire knew it was time for Ethan to rest. She helped him settle comfortably on the couch, ensuring he was warm and at ease. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "And remember, you're not alone. You can always lean on someone when you need it." Ethan nodded, closing his eyes with a sense of calm that had been absent before. "Thanks, Claire," he whispered, "for everything." Claire stayed for a moment longer, watching him breathe steadily, feeling the peace that now filled the room. She realized that this evening had changed something fundamental between them. Their relationship had shifted, becoming stronger, richer, and more emotionally intimate in a healthy, wholesome way. It wasn't about physical attraction. It was about trust, care, and the gentle power of human connection. Finally, Claire rose quietly and began tidying the living room. She felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride in knowing she had been able to provide not just relief from tension, but emotional support and comfort. She knew that these small acts, listening, guiding, caring, could have profound effects on relationships. And she understood that the bond she and Ethan shared was now built on a foundation of mutual respect, emotional openness, and heartfelt connection. Before heading to her own room, Claire paused by the doorway and looked back at Ethan. He was asleep, calm and content, a faint smile on his lips. She felt a warmth in her chest, a mix of relief, care, and the quiet joy of having made a meaningful difference in someone's life. It was the kind of satisfaction that came from nurturing, from connecting on a deeply human level, and from knowing that trust and kindness had the power to heal. As she turned to go to bed, Claire reflected on the past few days. The bond they had formed through simple acts of car massages, conversation, and emotional presence had grown into something profound. It wasn't just about helping Ethan relax. It was about creating a safe space where honesty, trust, and understanding could flourish. And she knew that this connection would continue to grow, shaping their relationship in ways that were gentle, heartfelt, and deeply human. For both of them, the evening had been transformative. It had been a night of emotional honesty, trust, and comfort. Claire understood that the connection they shared was rare and valuable, something that would influence the way they communicated, cared for each other, and navigated life's challenges together. And as she finally turned off the lights and headed to her own room, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that sometimes emotional closeness and genuine care could be just as powerful and just as meaningful as anything else in life.